This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannan.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, the world outrage against Israel's genocide in Gaza continues. The active starvation of Palestinian children, women, and civilians in Gaza continues every single day, Jamal. Tens of Palestinians are being murdered by the Israeli military as they scramble to get basic foodstuffs. And despite that, Palestinian children are literally starving to death. And that's going to be the main topic of our discussion today, Jamal, in addition to the ongoing genocide. Two major Israeli human rights organizations have accused the Israeli government of committing genocide in Gaza. This is coming from within the state of Israel itself, so they're seeing cracks within Israeli society. World-renowned Israeli writer David Grossman has also said that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. More countries, and this has been the big news this last week, Jamal, plan to recognize Palestine in September at the UNGA as a state, and this includes France, England, Canada, Malta, and Portugal, in addition to the some 45 states that already recognize Palestine. There's a growing interest in recognizing Palestine as a state. We will talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that. In another story, Anthony Aguilar, we mentioned this briefly last week, a retired U.S. Green Beret lieutenant colonel who worked as a subcontractor with UG Solutions in Gaza for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid delivery operation, recounted his own eyewitness testimony, Jamal, that Israel committed war crimes and Israeli soldiers were shooting at innocent civilians, further committing more war crimes. We're going to be covering all those stories today, Jamal. But before we do that, we're going to watch a fantastic interview that you did with Alex Duvall, the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's going to discuss the famine crisis in Gaza, which is the main topic of global concern right now.
That's right, Jess. And we'll start with our first story. This was a great interview, actually, with one of the leading experts on famine, by the way. On March 3rd, when Israel imposed a complete siege on food and life essentials entering Gaza, humanitarian experts warned and predicted a famine. Since then, many Palestinians have succumbed to death from starvation, most of them children and others who are most vulnerable. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 Palestinians have been reported killed by Israeli forces while desperately seeking aid at the U.S.-Israel-sponsored Gaza Humanitarian Foundation outposts. Joining us on Arab Talk to discuss the famine crisis in Gaza is Alex Duvall. He is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's an authority on famine and has worked on the Horn of Africa since the 1980s as a researcher and practitioner. His book, Mass Starvation: The History and Future of Famine, treats the subject in depth. Welcome to Arab Talk, Alex.
It's good to be with you.
You're a scholar of global famine. In your book about mass starvation, you note that although there have been catastrophic famines in the past 140 years, from 1980 on, they decreased dramatically. For most people of my generation, we think of the Live Aid benefit concert in 1985 to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia. The starvation in Gaza was totally predictable, thus preventable and man-made. How was this allowed to happen?
So it is deeply shocking and disturbing. So I began my career as a researcher and humanitarian at that time of Live Aid. I started in Sudan in 1984, and my PhD was in Sudan in the 1980s. And really, for the first few decades, I was actually optimistic what we could see was that famines were declining in number. They were becoming less lethal. The humanitarian apparatus, the aid givers were becoming better resourced. They had better reach, and the technologies for predicting and preventing these food crises and for giving assistance to those in need were increasing by leaps and bounds. And you just mentioned my book, Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine. So I began writing that 10 years ago, and I began writing it with the question, why have famines disappeared? Why is it actually we are on the point of defeating famine? So it was, if you like, a celebration of the fact that we were making real progress in this. Sadly, during the writing of the book, we began to see some signs of reversal. And the key to that was that starvation was being used as a weapon, was being used in Yemen, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Nigeria, more recently in Ethiopia and in Syria too. And now what we see in Israel is those familiar methods of starving people for war goals or indeed genocidal goals, but implemented with a degree of rigor and ruthlessness that I don't think any other government in recent history has been able to match.
So what you're saying, actually, I mean, historically, starvation was used as a weapon of war. I mean, I can think of examples going back to the medieval time and beyond. And now you're saying that Gaza, when you compare it to other man-made starvations, is worse?
So let me tell you how it's different. So historically, I mean, if we take the 20th century, you had cases like the German hunger plan, where the Germans in Eastern Europe and the then Soviet Union had a quota. They wanted to starve to death 30 million people, kill 30 million people through starvation, including Jews.
Wow.
They didn't actually reach that quota. So that was on a monumental scale. Stalin's Holodomor famine in Ukraine killed maybe 3 million people. And that was a genocidal famine. In fact, Raphael Lemkin, who was the originator of the term genocide, the Polish Jew who wrote that famous book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, he gave a lecture about the Stalin's genocidal starvation. And he said, starvation was a weapon aimed at the national spirit of Ukraine. He said the object of starvation that Stalin was using was not so much to kill people through starvation, but to break the spirit, the customs, the culture, the society of Ukraine. So we had those. We've had, after World War II, there was Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge starved 1.2 million people in Cambodia. The Ethiopian communists at the time of Live Aid, they caused a major famine. So, and even today, what is unfolding in Sudan is larger in numbers than what is happening in Gaza. There are some 8 million people in Sudan in desperate need of humanitarian aid, and about 1 million in famine conditions. So Gaza is not the largest in the world, but what makes Gaza unique is this, which is that if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted this to stop, he could stop it. So compare Sudan today. You have all these people in desperate need. If the warring parties in Sudan, General al-Burhan and General Hameti, were to sign a ceasefire today, it would take time, effort, money, logistics to bring what is needed to the hungry in Sudan. But if Israel were to give the green light to ending starvation in Gaza, the United Nations, very professional humanitarian agencies stand ready and willing. They could move tomorrow. There's enough resources, enough skills, enough capacity. Every child in Gaza could have breakfast tomorrow if Benjamin Netanyahu were to say so. So that's what makes it different. It's not larger in scale. It is it is the most minutely controlled and engineered case of starvation in modern history.
So mentioning the UN has a system, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, that categorizes levels of food insecurity according to severity. What is happening now in Gaza is compared to level 5 famine. Does the world need an official classification when we see on TV, on the internet, skeletal babies and people with our own eyes? I mean, you could you can tell that they are starving. What do you think about over reliance on what might be an otherwise a good method of evaluating a crisis before acting?
I think it's a very good question. So this system was set up not actually in order to say there is famine, there isn't famine, but in order to give early warning, to say that we are on a trajectory towards this, and to say some locations are more in need than others. So they produce these maps, and if you look at the map of, say, Sudan or Somalia or Yemen, you will see some places colored orange, there's need, some places colored red, there's urgent need, a few places in green, they're okay. So it was, and when it was set up, those who set it up to run it never thought that Western governments would wait until that famine designation had been arrived at before they acted. The whole idea was, we will give you early warning so it doesn't get there. And if you read what they say in their reports, what they actually say is, you need to do this, this, and this in order to stop it becoming famine. Now, what's happened in the case of Gaza is two things. First of all, those actions have not been taken. And second, Israel has stopped them from gathering data. So in order to get the necessary information, you need to have food monitors and aid workers on the ground. And that's not the case. They can do some telephone surveys. But imagine if you are a Palestinian in Gaza and your cell phone is down to 5%, you are not going to answer a questionnaire from some, unknown person who's ringing you up to ask you about what you've been eating over recent days. You're going to keep that 5%. So the quality of data has gone down, and that's why what the IPC did this week was essentially said, we know that famine is unfolding, even though we don't have all the data points. It's as though you went to your family doctor and you had a terrible fever, and it's very easy to diagnose what the fever is. The doctor will immediately start treating you, even while she may do some tests, send some things off to the laboratory. But the idea is, you don't wait for the lab tests to come back before you get treated. You get treated emergent, immediately. And this is what we see. We can diagnose this, at sight. This is a patient who has walked through the door. We know this child needs to be fed. We don't need any more information than that.
Let's clarify the word famine that we've been talking about, because for most people it means lack of food alone. I mean, that's the kind of the simple understanding. What is the comprehensive meaning of famine?
So famine has different aspects to it. So clearly lack of food is fundamental to it. But it's also the case that many of those who perish during famine, particularly children, pass away from disease. So if your body is undernourished, the sorts of everyday stomach upsets or coughs and wheezes that our children get, and maybe they stay home from school for a day or two, if a child is severely undernourished, they may die of that. But there's something else that is very important in famine, which is, think of, sharing the meal with your family, the breaking of bread, very fundamental to every culture, every religious tradition, is sharing bread with your family and your friend. Now, when I first went to study famine in Sudan in the 1980s, what struck me most powerfully was that for the people who were experiencing this, yes, they were afraid of hunger, they were afraid of their children dying, but they were also profoundly afraid of the breaking apart of society. So for them, the core definition of famine was when people start, instead of sharing bread, they fight for bread. Instead of being able to, welcome people and say, this is your food, let's eat it together. Everyone is scrambling to get their share. And that basic set of social relations breaks down, and it is the survival of the fittest, the strongest. People are stealing food, they are hiding food, they are scavenging in garbage to get food. That is famine. It is a deeply humiliating process. And I think one of the most important things that we see and hear from Gaza is the humiliation, the degradation, the dehumanization of people who are forced to behave like animals. In fact, I'm being unkind to animals. They're being deeply, deeply dehumanized by this process of starvation. That's what famine is.
Well, you're absolutely correct, because that's kind of like my next question, to talk about the humanitarian travesty occurring at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the U.S.-Israel aid distribution points, and why they are not only completely inadequate in fulfilling their humanitarian mission, also death traps, but then talking about lack of dignity, because dignity is an essential criterion in UN humanitarian aid distribution, and the humiliation that you are talking about.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the things that most upsets professional humanitarians and, of course, the Palestinians of Gaza and everyone who feels for them. What the UN, UNRWA, and the World Food Programme and other agencies, UNICEF and the Red Crescent, were trying to do was to bring essential assistance to people where they were, in support of their families, in support of their communities, with dignity. Now, what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation does is the opposite of that. It basically forces people to, first of all, to risk their lives, because you have to go there. You have to go, and because these ration stations are only open for a very short time, sometimes 20, 30 minutes, at short notice, you need to camp out in the rubble. And then you need to rush past these IDF checkpoints. And of course, those who get there first are the youngest and fittest and strongest. And they will then seize what they can. And because these are big, cumbersome boxes, they will break them open. They will take what they want. They'll put them in sacks. They will disappear. Then the younger, the weaker, the women will show up. They will scavenge for scraps. And then after a while, the contractors who are running the GHF stations or the IDF soldiers will say, time's up. And they'll throw grenades, they'll fire bullets, clear people out. Some will die there. Others will be robbed on the way home. And it is one of the questions we need to ask the GHF is that, okay, you say you gave out 1 million meals yesterday, 1.5 million meals. Who ate those meals? You can't tell us. Israel says we have put the GHF there to stop Hamas taking food. For all we know, Hamas is taking and selling or eating most of this food. There is no way of telling. Whereas the UN can account for every meal that it gives out, the GHF cannot. And I think that apart from the deep inhumanity and the lack of dignity of the GHF mechanism and the sheer danger that it exposes people to, the fact that it's not even stopping Hamas getting its hands on food, for all we know, is another. It's a shocking testament to the fact that Israel doesn't actually care about this factor, that its intent is something else.
You've mentioned Raphael Lemkin, and it's also in your book you talk about him, the man who coined the term genocide and argued for its perpetrators to be prosecuted. You mentioned his particular concern with hunger as a weapon to destroy people's souls and bodies. Do you see this as one of Israel's objectives in its siege?
So I do actually see that. I see that very clearly. And I see something that has not been widely acknowledged here, which is that I'm British. So the British government, when challenged on the question of genocide, says it is for the court to determine. Now, there is a case before the International Court of Justice, and probably it will take 2 or 3 years. And maybe in 2 or 3 years, the court will say Israel is responsible for genocide or not, or find some other form of words. But if you look at the Genocide Convention, it is the convention to prevent and punish genocide. Now, when the International Court of Justice took the case at the beginning of last year, it took the case because it said there is a genuine risk that the Palestinian people of Gaza will be subject to the kinds of conditions that make it that are genocidal. Regardless of whether Israel is doing this, they put that question on or is responsible for it. They said this is what is in prospect, and they look particularly at those humanitarian conditions. So both the humanitarian conditions of people starving as individuals, but also they were concerned with how Palestinian society in Gaza was being put under strain and potentially broken as a society. Now that activates a duty to prevent. So Israel was then put on notice. There are certain things you need to do to prevent these outcomes. Israel, of course, has not done that, but also other states have an obligation under the Genocide Convention to do their best to make sure that their duty to prevent genocide is fulfilled. And at the absolute minimum, they should not be arming or funding or supporting acts that could be genocidal. It's not as though you have to prove genocide and then say, oh, let's not do this. The burden of proof now is there is plausibly a case for genocide. The obligation is to ensure that it does not happen. And that obligation, I think, is not being fulfilled.
There are those that continue to deflect and deny the ongoing starvation of the people in Gaza. Certainly, Israel denies that there is starvation or there is genocide there. You have written that there is a familiar playbook used by architects of starvation campaigns throughout history to deny what they are doing. Can you provide some examples?
So, yes, indeed. I mean, there are various stratagems that are used over the years. Stalin's denial of the genocide in Ukraine is perhaps the most famous example. He said the words, "One man's death from hunger is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic." And he kept the press corps out of Ukraine. No one could report that. So just keeping the press out. And of course, in the case of Israel, we have Palestinian journalists who are reporting very bravely, courageously, and giving some absolutely harrowing accounts. They're under enormous personal danger, and they're suffering hunger themselves. And it is entirely due to them that we know what we know. But the international press corps has been kept out, and the international press corps, has more resources, capacity, and let's be candid, the Americans will listen to correspondence from CNN or Fox News in a way that they will never listen, to Palestinian journalists. So keeping the journalists out is one thing. Another is which the British used. The British and my own government, Britain, was probably responsible for more famines than any other in Africa and Asia. But in Bengal in World War II, Britain was responsible for a famine that killed 3 million people, and they just forbade the use of the word famine. And that got around by actually publishing pictures. of what was happening without any commentary, just the pictures. And the pictures are very powerful. But it's interesting, when pictures come out, those who see the pictures also try and explain them away. So one of the things that we see now is that there was one particular photograph used by the New York Times of a starving boy. I forget his name, but he was not only starving, but had a pre-existing condition of cerebral palsy. And those on the side of Israel are saying, this was a fabrication. This kid is not starving. He's suffering from this pre-existing condition, and it's not our fault. Well, just a moment. Israel knew that in Gaza, before this war, there were numerous adults and children suffering from all sorts of illnesses, chronic illnesses, cerebral palsy, cancer, heart disease, liver disease, you name it, people who needed treatment. Is it okay to inflict starvation, to deprive these people of medical facilities and then say, oh, but they were ill anyway? That doesn't work. It's actually an aggravating factor in a crime if you know that that person is weak or defenseless. If I were to go out in the street and attack a healthy young man, and I would be guilty of assault. If I were to go and attack a frail grandmother and knock her to the ground, I would be more guilty than if I attack a healthy man. So these denials, they simply don't work. And I would challenge the Israeli government. You say starvation is a bald-faced lie. Allow the press in. Allow the food monitors in. Then let us see who is telling the truth and who is lying.
So even if, as we're witnessing now, there is some sort of a global mobilization. I don't see it as full-fledged, but recently, within just the past few days, there is a global mobilization to get adequate food and life essentials into Gaza, different ideas, airdrops, opening the border with Egypt and so forth. But we've had some medical experts on this show who have said that in many cases, especially where children are concerned or where children who suffer from different ailments are concerned, the damage is irreversible and some will die regardless. What's your opinion on this?
So there's 2 points to make here. The first is that tragically, a young child that suffers serious malnutrition has that as a life sentence. The children of Gaza today, many of them will not grow up to achieve their full potential. They won't be as tall, as strong. Their cognitive capabilities will be less. We know this from studies that have been done of survivors of, say, the Dutch hunger winter of 1944-45. The Dutch have extremely good records. And you can see the children, as they grew up, they didn't do as well as their elder brothers and sisters. And indeed, young girls who came through that, even their own children suffered. So there is a lifelong element to this. But the more immediate element, which I'm sure your physicians was talking about, is there comes a point in the process of starvation where food is not enough. A very severely, acutely malnourished child needs urgent medical attention. If you give them just regular food, they won't be able to digest it. They will die. They will be in serious danger. Those children need to be in hospital. So, all the discussion that there is now of let's have airdrops, let's, flood it with food, that's fine. That food come. But we have thousands, possibly tens of thousands of children. We don't know the numbers. We need people in there to find this out. They need to be in hospital. And we know the condition of the hospitals in Gaza. They need to be in intensive care. They need to have that specialist equipment, those specialist nurses and doctors caring for them. And those nurses and doctors themselves need to be well fed. They need to be rested. Their families need to be taken care of. This can't be done just by saying, let's airdrop some food, let's have some humanitarian pauses for a few hours, a few corridors. Basically, the entirety of Gaza needs to be in one total intensive care unit. Those children need to have some form of intensive feeding, intensive care, and their families and their caregivers. This is the kind of humanitarian operation that surpasses the regular modalities of operation of UN agencies. And Israel knows this. If you look at how Israel treated the hostages who were released, and Hamas had treated them badly, appallingly. Some of them had been starved. They'd been traumatized. They came back to Israel, and they were given real state-of-the-art physical, intensive care, psychological care, rehabilitation. And every one of them deserved it. And every child in Gaza deserves the same expertise, the same resources, the same compassion. They are all human beings.
Many people in Palestine and elsewhere say the world watched Palestinians die and starve to death for 2 years. And now we're seeing actions by governments. Your government in Britain wants to recognize the Palestinian state. France started that, Canada, Portugal, and so forth. What was the tipping point when they went on for 2 years just basically sitting on the sidelines and saying, no, there is no genocide there, and Israel got to release, Hamas has to release all the hostages. Meanwhile, they just didn't pay attention to the ordinary man and woman and child in Gaza.
Well, I think we spoke earlier about denialism, and I think part of it was denialism. And of course, the Israeli government has a very, very powerful information machine and a lot of influence. I think what made the difference was the pictures. I think there was a moment at which there were so many pictures of these truly, truly desperate children that it could no longer be ignored. And it's the act of taking and transmitting those pictures is itself deeply painful and humiliating, because those pictures are so intrinsically humiliating and stripping of dignity. We do not want to see people portrayed like this. People do not want to be known to the world to be in this condition of utter destitution and desperation. And I think we need also to reflect on how far gone, how far along the photographers, the journalists, and their families were, how desperate they were to be prepared to say, we are ready to have our children photographed in this manner and these photographs shown to the world. That shows how truly desperate we are, that we are ready to suffer this, face this indignity. And I really pray and hope that the reward for this is that the world not only takes notice, which is taking notice, but acts with the speed and the compassion that is required.
Alex de Waal, thank you so much for coming on Arab Talk. Your knowledge is truly indispensable.
Thank you very much. And really, my sympathy, my condolences to all of those of your audience who are suffering, whose relatives are suffering, and who are pained and traumatized by the unbearable situation that is being inflicted upon them. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been talking about starvation. We've been talking about genocide. As someone said, we don't have to wait for the Israelis to acknowledge this, but we really appreciate that now that you have two major Israeli human rights organizations that have accused Israel's government of committing genocide in Gaza. The first organization is B'Tselem, which also was one of the first organizations to say that Israel is an apartheid state. And then you have Physicians for Human Rights, which also says that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And the country's Western allies have a legal and moral duty to stop it. So they basically simultaneously almost made that declaration. They worked on two different reports. The Physicians for Human Rights focused on the health situation, the deteriorating health situation, the bombing of hospitals. We've actually had the executive director, we've interviewed him a while back prior to kind of making that official declaration. And next week, just to remind our listeners and those who watch us, we will be talking to Asil Abu Ras, the director of the Occupied Territories Department at Physicians for Human Rights. She will be discussing their newly released report entitled Destruction of Conditions of Life, Health Analysis of the Gaza Genocide. So, again, I don't know the number of organizations that have pretty much said that there is a genocide.
Yeah, but in some ways, the entire world sees this as a genocide. The entire world sees this as starvation.
Except officially in the United States, because they still say that there is no starvation and there is no genocide. But then I don't know how you dispute when you have your own two leading human organizations who are on the ground in Israel. They are Israeli. They're coming under tremendous pressure and attack to say that it is a genocide. I mean, both their reports, just detailed crimes, including the killing of tens of thousands of women, children, elderly people, mass forced displacement and starvation, the destruction of homes and civilian infrastructure, the destruction of the healthcare system, the education system. I mean, it's all pretty much listed, discussed. They provided evidence, eyewitness reports, even reports from foreigners, like foreign doctors who were on the ground, who went there. And if you see their interviews, these doctors, they're in tears when they talk about what's going on in Gaza.
Well, yeah, Jamal, because bearing witness to starvation of children is one of the most grotesque things that any human being should have to bear witness to. And this gets to the utter depravity of the state of Israel and its current leaders, because you have the entire world seeing with their own eyes that Palestinian children are starving to death. We have evidence, undisputed evidence, that the amount of aid getting into Gaza has been reduced significantly, and Palestinian civilians are still being murdered when they go for that aid. Yet you have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying over and over again on the world stage, there is no starvation. Not only is he lying and gaslighting, nobody believes him, Jamal. Not even President Trump, who said this week that their Palestinian children are starving, you can't make this up, and that he's going to do something about it. Unfortunately, with Witkoff there trying to observe the situation with Ambassador Huckabee, we see no changes. It's been 3 days since they had that visit, Jamal. There have been no changes to the amount of aid. And just last night, 20 more Palestinians were murdered trying to get food, desperately needed food for their children. So, Israel and the United States continue to get away with murder, literally murder and genocide, despite the world saying enough is enough.
Well, we've seen the little change, and the little change may be symbolic.
It's symbolic.
Countries like the UAE, Jordan, and other countries, again, back to the airdrops. And
meaningless.
Well, it's a drop in the bucket. I'm not going to criticize any action or any act to try to bring food into Gaza. I've seen, Egyptian civilians who fill bottles of plastic bottles, basically, with beans, with lentils, and drop them in the Mediterranean Sea, and some of those drift over to Gaza to feed these people. I've seen people from Gaza going and bringing those so they can make themselves, I guess, lentil soup or something like this. So any actions, even those airdrops, are good. And what came out actually of these airdrops, which the Israelis they don't want you to see, several of these people who were on the planes took photographs and pictures and videos of the destruction, and you could see entire like neighborhoods totally destroyed to the ground, kind of like images from World War II, maybe even worse than that. So there is some good coming out of that. Some trucks are going through, maybe additional aid. Again, you have to feed.
But it's really not enough, Jamal. Honestly,
it's not enough. I'm not saying it's enough, but I'm saying anything is better than nothing. And they are, you have to feed 2 million people, and you have to feed 2 million people who have been starved for months. You're not like just adding some extra, supplies to your neighborhood supermarket, just. But these people don't have anything, so you're starting from scratch. They don't even have refrigeration. They don't have electricity.
Nothing.
And so it's going to take a long time to kind of get all that food in. Adding to our story about now 2 Israeli organizations saying that Israel is committing genocide and is basically starving people, the award-winning Israeli author David Grossman has described his country's campaign in Gaza as genocide and said he now can't help but use the term. And I'm quoting some of his interviews, and he's saying that now I can't help myself, not after what I've read in the papers, not what I've seen these images and the images I've seen, not after speaking with people who have been there. This word is an avalanche. Once you say it, it just gets bigger like an avalanche, and it adds even more destruction and suffering. And I've listened to the interviews by the representatives of Bet Salem, I guess the executive director, who said that basically doesn't bring him pleasure to accuse his country of starvation, but he has to do it because he has conscience. So it's indisputable, Jess. I mean, that's the crazy thing about it, including former Prime Minister of Israel, politicians, scientists, doctors, and you name it, saying that we are committing genocide, we are starving these people, and then to have the Israeli government deny that, and then that denial gets parroted by some countries. I don't know what are they going to do in the future when that evidence is all provided, and how they're going to backtrack from this, Jess.
But they can't backtrack, Jamal. But here's the thing. The Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite what we're hearing from Trump and the US government, continues to get the full support, including weapons, including political cover, because the United States continues to veto resolutions in the United Nations. It continues to provide political as well as military cover for Israel. And as long as the United States continues to cover up and support the genocide, Prime Minister Netanyahu will continue, and his government, and it's through its infrastructure, will continue to commit this genocide. And Jamal, despite what you hear from the White House and everybody, will continue to starve Palestinian children. We haven't seen, despite the outrage, despite saying, "Oh, we're gonna support and acknowledge Palestine as a state." That's fine, Jamal, but it's rubbish when it comes to the fact that Palestinian children are still starving to death, and there are thousands of trucks waiting at the Egyptian border, waiting to come in with food, water, and medicine that are being denied entry by the government of Israel. Mm-hmm. So net, Jamal, despite all these great, statements, which in my opinion are still a little bit too late. It's a little bit late to the table saying that Israel is committing genocide. We've known it for a long time. we're still seeing this mass starvation. We're still seeing the holdup of aid getting in to Gaza. So despite the international pressure, Israel continues to get away with this mass murder, starvation, and genocide of Palestinians, Jamal. I don't see how it changes. Do you?
Well, I mean, will only change. I mean, the genocide
How will it
already
change?
the genocide has already been committed. I think what changes things is when those who perpetrated it are brought to justice. And we're
Yes.
not talking about Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant and whatever. I'm talking about the generals, the other ministers who have been calling for the death and destruction of Palestinians. Thousands of probably soldiers who filmed themselves in Gaza. I know we've talked about this topic. There's an organization, the Hind Rajab Foundation,
Right.
that's basically collecting all that data. But this is something that's going to be tried, I would say, in the litigated in the
Yes.
International Court of Justice, and maybe for years to come.
Decades, probably
And
decades, Jamal. I mean,
and collecting all the evidence. We even don't know. They haven't allowed, except those few embedded journalists now going to those distribution sites. They haven't allowed foreign journalists to go inside and investigate. Aside from the Palestinian journalists, and I should say Israel has killed more than 200 of them, we don't know the number of people killed under the rubble. We have no idea. I mean, this to me, this figure now reached 60,000 people dead, about 20,000 children killed. I think the numbers are going to be multiples of this. Once they start like investigating, once they start removing that rubble, once they start conducting statistics, asking families who is missing, and so forth, the numbers are going to be much higher. Anyway,
absolutely.
I wanted to mention something because you said about Egypt, even though I wasn't planning to discuss it today, just as quickly. Egypt's coming under attack, and I think it's unjustly coming under attack, and it's a deflection, including those who demonstrate at the Egyptian consulates or embassies around the world, saying Egypt is not doing enough. Egypt must open the border. Egypt does not control the Rafah border. Israel controls the Rafah border. People have to understand this. There are trucks, yes, on the other side, but there are more trucks under Israeli control that Israel has prevented for months to enter, and its settlers have been attacking and destroying those goods that are in these trucks. And Egypt is under enormous pressure to open its border. And you know why? And now this whole campaign to force Egypt to open its border is to basically ethnically cleanse the people in Gaza. They want to push them. And that's one of the reasons Egypt has been very careful about this, because once you open those gates, Palestinians are going to flood into Egypt because they know that they don't expect the Egyptian army to shoot them like what the Israelis do. And once they rush in there, and that's the plan, is to basically send 1 million Palestinians into Egypt. And that's not going to happen. So I'm asking people to kind of think about that before kind of slamming Egypt and criticizing Egypt and deflecting from the real perpetrator, which is the Israeli government that has been doing this.
I think that's a really good analysis. I mean, the Egyptian government has plenty to deserves lots of criticism, but that's not the criticism, because you're right. They don't control the border. Israel controls that border. And
it's a whole deflection. It's something new to put pressure on Egypt to open the border to basically get rid of people living in Gaza. I want to move on to the next story just because.
We have. Let's go.
In the intro, you've mentioned we have more countries plan to recognize Palestine in September at the UN General Assembly. France, England, Canada, Malta, and Portugal. Just to remind our listeners, before France, 10 out of the 27 EU countries had already recognized Palestinian statehood. Belgium was about to recognize Palestinian statehood, but has delayed any decision on the Palestinian recognition until early September, so you could add that into the mix. Last year, Ireland, Norway, and Spain recognized Palestinian statehood. Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and Romania recognized Palestinian statehood back in 1988, well before they became members of the EU. And you mentioned the number. The number is actually, I think now about 147 of the 193 member states of the United Nations recognize Palestine as a state. Well, guess what? 147, that's more than many countries in the world, basically, that recognize a Palestinian state. So the recognition itself, it's a nice gesture, but has done nothing, because if you
It's
have
nothing, Jamal.
147 countries recognize a Palestinian state and you're still under occupation, the West Bank is under occupation. Israel has moved almost 1 million people into the West Bank. 800,000 of them are probably from the United States. And Gaza has always been a large open air prison. Okay, so you can add to the mix. The only thing I said, and I repeat that last week, now you get some of the heavy hitters like France and the UK
But so what, Jamal?
that might go through that recognition, and Canada and
what?
wherever.
So
I
what?
know it's symbolic. That's why when I say it's not like 0 countries recognize Palestine. Just to remind, it's 147. Many countries are in the EU, and then basically the developing world, most of the developing world basically recognizes the state of Palestine, but that does not mean anything when you have someone in Ramallah who is recognized as the president of the Palestinian state, Mahmoud Abbas, who cannot travel into Jordan without permission from the Israeli government, who
Yeah,
cannot
that's
go
why.
from Ramallah into Jerusalem, who cannot go to Bethlehem without coordinating with the Israeli government. So just by name saying that's a recognition, and when you don't have really sovereignty, is really meaningless.
Exactly, Jamal. And let's not forget that as soon as those announcements were made, Israel threatened to formally annex the West Bank, formally annex all of the territory. I mean, functionally, they've already annexed it, Jamal. Functionally, they control everything, as we've been talking about forever now. But now they want to internationalize it and legalize the annexation. So, you know, I guess I'm just one of those people that says this is a completely empty statement with barely any symbolic nature to it, because the facts on the ground remain really, really devastating and grave for Palestinians.
Just quickly on this topic before we go to our final story.
Yeah.
You said Israel also has threatened to boycott, or the Israelis will not travel to those countries who will recognize the state of Palestine,
Oh,
such
really?
as France. And I'm
Oh,
saying,
good.
like, to myself, I look at all the different reports and wherever Israelis are not welcome there. I haven't seen them being welcomed in European countries for many months now, and I
No, they're
don't
not
know,
welcome.
and I don't think they have any impact, on these countries as far as financially. So again, that's an empty threat, and it's just like, for sure, Israel has more to lose if these countries boycott it by not buying its products, and or send people to travel there, or sell it weapons and so forth. So it's the other way around, and they're acting like they're doing the world a favor by traveling to these countries.
Yeah, I think the boycott, we've said this, Jamal, the boycott is far more powerful than the recognition. Boycotting Israel, divest and sanctioning Israel is far more powerful than the symbolic recognition of a Palestinian state. But we'll come back to that at another time.
So our last story again, and all these stories just like again demonstrate the genocide, demonstrate the starvation. Anthony Aguilar, a retired U.S. Green Beret lieutenant colonel who worked as a subcontractor with the UG Solutions in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid delivery operation. He has been now making the round on many channels, and talking about how he witnessed war crimes committed by Israeli soldiers. He describes, Jess, and I'm sure our listeners, or if they haven't watched him, that's easy. Just Google his name. He's on many. He's been on many interviews. He, in particularly, talks about with a lot of emotion. He describes an incident on May 28th at a distribution site where he says he witnessed a young boy named Amir being shot and killed by Israeli soldiers shortly after receiving food aid. And I'm quoting here, this little boy is similar in age to my son. He wasn't ISIS. He wasn't a combatant. He was barefoot, starving, holding a small bag of rice, some lentils, a half bag of flour. That's all he had. Then the shooting started. The boy came to thank them. He thanked them. He thanked him, kissed his hand, and thanked him. And then the shooting started. And he said bullets were fired around the crowds into the air, and then later onto their feet. You know, this kid walked, he describes 12 kilometers to get there. And when he got there, he thanked us for the remnants and the small crumbs that he got. And then he kissed me. He said, thank you in English, thank you. And he collected his items and he walked back to the group. Then he was shot at. First with pepper spray, then tear gas, stun grenades, and the bullets shot in the air and on his feet, and he runs away and basically was shot. So he quit, and he said, when he was asked who was doing the shooting, he said, it's the IDF doing the shooting into the crowd and the civilians.
Of course.
And human beings, they were dropping to the ground, getting shot. And Amir was one of them. And then he said, our client, which when we talk about the foundation, which is the US Israeli, is the IDF. And then he also had another, I said he has multiple interviews, including an interview with US Senator Chris Van Hollen. And he said that the Israeli military was not only involved in the violence, but was directly giving orders to contractors on the ground to do the shooting also.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Do we need any more evidence, Jamal, of complicity in the genocide between the Israeli government, its contractors, and now the United States? This is actively going on every day. We've been talking about it for a very long time, yet here you have a contractor who is subcontracted with the GHF, who witnessed it with his own eyes.
And he's a lieutenant colonel, or former, with the Green Beret, so he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear the disinformation coming from the government of Israel against Mr. Aguilar, former Lieutenant Colonel Aguilar. They're saying he was a disgruntled employee.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so bizarre to see the disinformation. But you know what, Jamal? If we look at the Pew polling, and there's more polling that came out in this last week, the polling results globally and especially in the United States show ongoing, profound kind of antagonism toward Israel, negative perceptions of Israel, a complete reversal of the world opinion, and in the United States for the so-called Israeli war on Hamas. Everybody globally is saying that this is wrong and it should stop. But apparently, despite global opinions and all these other things, Israel continues to get a free pass, Jamal. And I'm really sorry to say this to our viewers and listeners. I don't see any change happening soon.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.